Hi everyone, my name is Tom Andino, and I'm one of the founding members of the Cyrenian Apostolate. And I'm here today with Father Jason Hage, who is the author of the book, The Cyrenian Way, Spiritual Poverty, and the Art of Accompaniment. Father Jason, thanks for being here.
It's good to be here, Tom.
Thank you. Can you first tell us the seeds of this book? Where did it start? Where did it come from? And what made you decide to write it down?
It's a great question. And if you have maybe 7 hours, I could go through the whole story. But no, it started back early on in my call story to the priesthood, because early on in my journey to the priesthood, especially my first couple of years of seminary, I was kind of confronted with this idea that I felt I had nothing to offer the Lord. And it was troubling, and it was disturbing. And I even got into an argument with Jesus where I basically said, "You don't know what you're doing. Why would you choose me? I literally have nothing to offer you. Do you really know what you're doing? This is not a good idea." And I just really wrestled with, especially in spiritual direction through that year in seminary. It was my second year of theology. So in my third year of formation, I just wrestled for an entire year with my spiritual director with this idea of poverty and spiritual poverty, and just tried to lean into it. And it was kind of painful at times, because I really did feel why the heck would God choose me? I felt like I had nothing to offer him, and I felt kind of impoverished. And then as I kept praying with it, and really this prayer has continued since that time, and that was probably, maybe 10, 12 years ago, to the point now with my current spiritual director, since I was ordained a priest 9 years ago, we've been walking together, and this theme of poverty kept coming up, and it was just this whole idea of, well, that's true, you have nothing to offer him, but what does he want? And then I recognized very quickly that all he wanted was me. And that was a very troubling insight, because I thought, well, that I'm confronted with everything in that moment. Why does he just want me? What does he find attractive about me? And I had a tough time understanding that kind of love. That before I offer anything, before I contribute anything to the building up of the kingdom, or service to the church, or service to my neighbor, all of that doesn't count in comparison to this, you are beloved before you can do anything for him. He's already loving you, and he's already choosing you, regardless of what you offer him. And that was this kind of beautiful and troubling revelation at the same time, where I was well, I'm sure there's so many people who struggle with the same thing of oh, if God's calling me, then I have to do something, and I have to contribute something, and maybe I have to use my skills, my talents, my abilities. Maybe that's why he's choosing me, because of my different talents and gifts, when he doesn't really care about any of that. He's only choosing you because he finds you lovely. And so really that's the founding of this apostolate, and the founding of this school of spirituality, is this idea that before anything even begins with this journey, you are already loved. You are a beloved son, a beloved daughter of God.
What you just said is so simple.
It is.
Deep and simple, in a world that is often shallow and very complex. And I want to ask you to clarify spiritual poverty and spiritually impoverished, because that runs throughout the book. Can you explain that to the viewers?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's probably the only technical part of the book, because it is so incredibly simple. It's almost disarming, because you're what is this thing really? But spiritual impoverishment is where you think that because you have nothing to offer God, that God is not interested in you. And so you think that a possibility of even a relationship with God is not possible, or would even, be possible, because you feel you literally have nothing to offer. So why would God love you? Or maybe you're choosing sin, or you're walking down a bad path in your life, and therefore you just give up and you say, well, why would God love me? Why would God be interested in me? And so spiritual impoverishment is that state of like, they look at their empty hands and they say, I have nothing to offer God. And they get discouraged by it because they don't even know where to begin or what steps to take to have that relationship with God. We all start spiritually impoverished. But the difference for the Cyrenian is that they lean into their spiritual impoverishment and allow it to be transformed into spiritual poverty. And all it is a change in lens. It's a change in attitude about your empty hands, because you stand empty-handed before the cross of Christ and you're like, how could I possibly be here? And why is the Lord inviting me into this when I'm empty-handed? So that's spiritual impoverishment, discouragement. And then when it changes into spiritual poverty, that's where you actually begin to rejoice in your poverty and own it as a great treasure and gift, because you recognize that the Lord is choosing you in love, not for anything you have to offer, but just because you can offer him your love and attention. I think that's one of the inspirations too of the Cyrenian Apostolate, is the words "I thirst" that St. Mother Teresa heard when she was called to found the Missionaries of Charity, is this idea that the Lord is just thirsting for your love and attention. That's all he wants, is your heart. And so let all the other stuff go and just come to him. And so when you can own your poverty as something that's a gift, then the Lord can begin to fill you up. Only when you recognize you're empty, then can he begin to fill you up with his treasures.
And I want to get to, okay, once we learn that, once we know it, accept it, believe it, what can we do with that? But before that, I want to ask you about the title of the book itself. This is the book. The Cyrenian Way, Spiritual Poverty and the Art of Accompaniment. Mm-hmm. So what is the Cyrenian Way for people that don't know?
Yeah, so like, put it blunt, it's just to help us become more compassionate Christians. That's the Cyrenian Way. By embracing these spiritual pillars, hopefully it produces more compassionate souls. And the thing with accepting your own spiritual poverty is that once you accept it as a gift and not something to be cursed or a source of discouragement, but as actually the starting point for your relationship with God, when you recognize, I am empty-headed, I need the Lord, then the Lord can begin his work. So connecting spiritual poverty and the art of accompaniment, it's this idea that once you accept your own poverty and your own need for the Lord, and also your own brokenness, your own woundedness, then all of a sudden your heart becomes much more compassionate to begin to enter into your neighbor's suffering and burdens and actually begin to carry them as if your own. And that's the art of accompaniment, is that you actually can enter into another person's suffering and carry it as if it's your own. And in that act of carrying another's cross is the perfection of the Christian life, because it produces the virtue of charity in the soul, which we know is a theological virtue, so it can only be received as a gift from heaven, the gift of charity, the gift of love. But the only way we can experience love in its fullness is by accompanying others. That's why Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. This fulfills all the law and the prophets.
That we do the Christian journey together.
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 Yeah, exactly.
When I read this, I was also, through my work at Lemoyne, looking at the apostolic preferences that the Jesuits were working on. And number 3 is accompany young people into a hope-filled future. But I think we can run the risk of missing the second part and allow yourself to be accompanied.
Yes.
By our young people, or by the person in front of you, whoever that is, to share that it's a dialogue. As a musician, I love the word accompaniment. I love that, because to me, sometimes it means stay in the background, offer support, anticipate. When you're working with musicians, that they might need you to offer assistance, but then get out of the way. But sometimes you listen, and sometimes you speak through the instrument. I think our walk with one another is like that.
It's a beautiful allegory.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that's the only way that the transformation of the human heart can happen, is by entering into the art of accompaniment, because it all comes from this living out of the knowledge that you're beloved. So then you can't help yourself but pour your love into another. But then it's also incumbent on the Cyrenian to allow themselves to be loved as well.
Yes.
because Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. So the only way you can love as Christ calls us to love is by first letting others love you as well, and to receive that love and accept that love. And when you're receiving love, to actually pause and say, I have to receive this. So that way I in turn can pour my life out and continue to pour my life out in love as Christ commands us.
I know for you and for me, Fred Rogers was a big influence on our life.
Absolutely.
And he would often say the biggest thing we can do is to help people know that they are loved and capable of loving. I think you just pick up on that.
And I think in that dialogue of love between yourself and the other and yourself, it's there that you can only begin to trust that you're truly loved. And not only loved, but also known and received. Like just known and received and loved. Like that you're never alone. You're never alone.
For who you are.
Exactly.
The book centers around 5 pillars. And I'm wondering if you can walk us through those. That's the invitation to spiritual poverty, a call in the silence, the sweet embrace, the mystery of all mysteries, which refers to the Eucharist, and Mother of Mercy. So let's start with an invitation to spiritual poverty and take our viewers through that.
Absolutely. So as I had mentioned already, I've been very moved by the story of St. Mother Teresa. And, you know, she felt this deep call, this powerful call to go out into the streets of Calcutta. And the thing that instigated that call was her hearing deep in her heart the words, I thirst, which are the words that come from the cross of Christ. And she was struck by these words because she realized that this wasn't a human thirst, you know, like satiating, you know, thirst or hunger. Jesus was actually thirsting for our love. He's thirsting for our attention. He's thirsting for souls. And the only thing that can console his heart is by us offering him his love and attention in return. And so she felt that so deeply, and that actually made her leave her religious congregation and to go into the streets of Calcutta to found her own religious order, because she felt that only by loving the poorest of the poor and by loving Christ in them could she then satiate the thirst of Jesus, because Jesus is just thirsting for our love and attention. And she saw in the eyes of the poor the eyes of Christ, Christ who is thirsting for our love and attention. And so Mother Teresa many times would only be able to, you know, bandage wounds, you know, accompany, because many of these people would be dying, you know, and so she would just accompany them until they took their last breath. Everyone's like, well, why don't you do more? And she's like, this is like, I'm accompanying Jesus. Like, what else could I be doing but just loving Jesus in them? And I feel communion with Jesus when I'm loving the poorest of the poor. So I just was struck with this idea of her going on the streets of Calcutta, searching for the poorest of the poor. And I thought to myself, well, it's hard for someone to do that kind of act of heroic virtue and those exercise of the corporal works of mercy. But I still think we're called to go out into the streets to look for the poorest of the poor. And then I started thinking about the spiritual works of mercy, which are just as compelling as the corporal works of mercy, but sometimes undervalued or never really spoken about. And so just as much as Mother Teresa was exercising the corporal works of mercy in a heroic way, which spoke volumes and spoke to believers and unbelievers alike. I mean, so many unbelievers had faith because of her. So too, those who exercise the spiritual works of mercy could actually be a compelling witness to the beauty and truth of the gospel. And so what does that mean for the Cyrenian? It means that they're satiating the thirst of Jesus and impoverished souls who are thirsting for just love and attention, who are literally starving for love and attention. And so when you and I begin to go out into the streets of our lives, our network of relationships, because I really see our network of relationships as the streets of Calcutta, because we have family, friends, colleagues, acquaintances, strangers, whatever. But every day we're coming in contact with so many people, and they're literally spiritually impoverished souls who are lying in the streets that are just waiting for someone to love them and to acknowledge them and to receive them and to even be able to receive their burden, even just for a time, to make their burden sweet and light. And in doing that, by carrying the burdens of others, we fulfill the law of Christ.
To see them.
To see them and to not pass them by. That's also one of the reasons why at the beginning of the book, there's just one simple line that says he approached the victim. Because the goal of this spirituality is to make sure that we never pass a victim by. God forbid that we pass those victims by in our life. And guess what? They're already present in our life, in family and friends and colleagues and acquaintances and strangers and neighbors, whoever you might think. They look like they got it together. Everyone's carrying a burden. And it's so rare when we have someone who can step out of the, normal pace and daily grind of life to say, I'm intentionally going to enter into the life of the other and look them in the eye and say, I see you.
Yes. And to genuinely mean it.
Exactly.
How are you? You look troubled. To have the courage to get out of our own way, to be an instrument of that balm,
Absolutely.
which is often healing. I want to read a quote from chapter 1, which is what you talked about. You open the book talking about Mother Teresa, and then you ask the reader to think about this question. What if we begin to see our network of relationships for what they really are? The streets of Calcutta. We pass by the spiritually impoverished on a daily basis. I know in my own life, the more I see it, it's harder to unsee it.
That's right.
And it's also harder not to engage it every time you can. I had an experience with a nurse when I was in the hospital, and just in a bad place. And my wife was concerned that I wasn't going to get good care. And I thought, there's something fueling this. Something's underneath. And so she came in and I asked her some questions and we visited. We had a great encounter. By the end of the night, she walked us to our car. And my wife looked at me and she said, you can't help yourself. I said, no, I can't. It's the beauty of doing this.
And I think that's going back to the example of Mother Teresa. Like so many times before she responded to this call, she would talk about how she would just pass by the poor in the streets. And then once she felt and heard this call and responded, she could not literally pass by a single poor soul on the side of the street. She would literally just be taken up into whoever was right in front of her. Because you can't, once you begin to see, you can't unsee it. And the same thing in the Cyrenian Way is once you begin to see this spiritually impoverished in your life, you can't unsee it. And you can't help but say, I want to enter into their story. I have to. Because this is a child of God. This is a beloved daughter, a beloved son of God. And I can't help but love them.
And the second pillar is the call. You talked about the call in the silence.
Yes.
Help us with that one.
Yeah, so I think in such a noisy culture today, I think that's one of the reasons why we do pass by the spiritually impoverished as often as we do. Again, I'm preaching to myself because we have so much noise. We're bombarded by noise and activity and commitments and calendars and schedules and time. And so the only way for us to tap into the voice that calls us to love our neighbor in this way is by literally turning everything off for a time every single day. And the only way we can come to terms with our own spiritual poverty is by the prayer of silence. Because when you pray silently or quietly, you're just confronted with your poverty. And I think that's one of the reasons why we avoid silence is because we don't want to confront our poverty. We don't want to reflect on the fact that, I feel I have nothing to offer, and who am I, and who am I before God? But the only way we can trust that voice that says you are beloved is by entering into the silence, because it's only in that quiet space, that inner room, in the sanctuary of your heart, where Christ can begin to speak that truth. And once we enter into that prayer of quiet, he speaks it to us again and again and again until we finally believe it. And that's why it takes the practice of daily silent prayer, for us to finally arrive at faith in the fact that I am beloved. In my poverty, I am lovely in the eyes of God. He finds me lovely.
Mhm.
And I think quiet prayer, silent prayer is the only thing that can teach us that.
Which leads us to the next one. Our interactions, I think, in the world that we live in, as you explained, fast-paced, transactional.
Mm-hmm.
You know, here's my money, give me a coffee, buy. Or transactional, not relational.
Mm-hmm.
And transactions aren't investments.
That's right.
You know, so the next pillar is the sweet embrace.
Mm.
The human connection.
That's
Can
right.
you take us to that one?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that's fostered by silent prayer is first a personal, intimate relationship with Jesus. And then once we start to experience this personal intimacy with him, then all of a sudden we experience this intimacy with our neighbor. This very deep experience of relationship and like relational ministry where all of a sudden when you begin to embrace your neighbor, you feel you're embracing Christ. Because silent prayer also teaches us the art of contemplation, which we begin to see the world through contemplative eyes. So now every person, every circumstance, every situation is saturated with God. And so when you look into the eyes of your neighbor, you actually begin to see the eyes of Jesus looking back at you.
Mhm.
And so when I look into the eyes of my neighbor, I see my Lord, my God. And then when we embrace Jesus, and really the sweet embrace is all about embracing the crosses in our life, because when we embrace our cross, we're embracing everyone's crosses. Because again, the whole point of the spiritual apostolate is to let people know that they're never alone, whatever burden they're carrying. And so we create this network of relationships based on this mode of pouring your life into the other.
Oh.
That's in this sweet embrace. As we embrace the cross, we embrace Jesus who is on it. And we embrace the cross of others. We embrace Jesus in them. And so it becomes this moment of Holy Communion where all of a sudden you're in the presence of Jesus every time you encounter a human being.
For my own experience, I think growing up being taught to see Christ in the eyes of your neighbor, it never got flipped to realizing that if that's in fact the case, then Christ is looking back at you.
Yes.
It's so powerful.
And everyone's saying, well, I love Jesus, I want Jesus, but I just wish he were here. Yeah. He is here. It's the ministry of relationship and the ministry of presence.
Mm.
And this idea that Jesus is looking you right in the eye every time you encounter your neighbor.
The ministry of presence is so important, but it's not about us.
That's right.
Right? And the next two pillars give us tools to strengthen us to do this work.
Absolutely.
Right? The Eucharist and Mary. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. Before we get to that, actually, with the sweet I want to mention this about the sweet embrace, is it's an invitation to walk away from one's ego once and for all. To like literally let go of oneself, deny oneself, so you think less about yourself and more about God and others. And that's where we can reach this place of freedom where we can love completely and fully. As we embrace the cross, we're actually letting ourselves go and leaving ourselves behind forever.
Mm.
But then by embracing others and embracing their crosses, we find ourselves again, but a truer sense of ourselves, the deepest sense of ourselves, our truest identity. So when we talk about the fourth spiritual pillar, which is the Eucharist, what we see in that little host, which has now become the body and blood of Christ, again, the simple elements of bread and wine, there's nothing more ordinary, more simple, right? But God chooses to be present to us in his fullness in these simple elements, these things that could be easily passed by, these things that you could brush by so easily and say, there's nothing here. But Jesus in his glory is choosing to be present to us in the simplicity of the poverty of these elements, right? It's such a beautiful expression of Jesus' own spiritual poverty. Because in the elements of bread and wine, he's truly showing that he is glorious to be found in poverty. Bread and wine now become his body and blood. But what we see in that little host is an egoless God. It's a God without an ego. And what that Eucharist teaches us is that Jesus, who is crucified on the cross, which the Eucharist makes present to us in real time, that our own path to happiness and joy and fulfillment, satisfaction, is only by pouring our lives out in love. And so the Eucharist is the promise of that. Because if we trust that self-gift, and we receive that self-gift into our bodies and souls and receive Holy Communion, then we find ourselves beginning to pour our lives out in the same way, holding nothing back. Because when Jesus is crucified, his hands are literally nailed to the cross. He literally can't defend himself. You make yourself completely vulnerable. And as a Cyrenian, you're invited to make yourself completely vulnerable, where the masks fall away. You have nothing to hide. And not only that, it teaches us how to bless our wounds. Because we begin to bless our poverty and we bless our woundedness. We bless the scars on our bodies and our souls. Because it's through those wounds that then we become the bridge to Christ for others.
Yes. That our own woundedness, that Christ kept his wounds after the resurrection.
That's right. And that's one of like the constant meditations in the spiritual Cyrenian Apostolate, is that Jesus kept his wounds. So our wounds are not to be dismissed, repressed. They're not to be cursed. They're not to be wished away. They're not to be prayed away. Because when Jesus rose from the dead, he kept his wounds.
Yeah.
Because the glory and grace and the mercy of God are flowing through those wounds to us. And we present our wounds to him in our poverty, and we touch our wounds to his, then all of a sudden that same divine power begins to flow through us to others in all of our relationships. And guess what? He can only work that grace for others through our woundedness, not through our strength. Because his power is made perfect in weakness. And so the Cyrenian basks in this weakness. He literally boasts in it, because he knows that it's only then that the glory of God and the majesty of God can begin to work in his life. We actually hold God back by being strong. And also it's an invitation of vulnerability. So when we meet our neighbor, it's actually our wounds that make us relatable, where they feel safe enough to share with us their burdens, because we ourselves are not afraid to say, I am one who is wounded. I am one who is broken.
When we do that with others, it can be a great gift to them. I think the person being vulnerable, we sometimes may perceive shame, embarrassment, sin, so we hold back. But to the person receiving it, they usually perceive courage or find strength for their own journey because somebody had the courage to share their burden with them. So it can be a great gift.
It can be liberating.
Yeah.
Because so many people don't share their burdens. And when those burdens aren't shared for a long time, sometimes years, it actually eats away at the soul, because we feel we can't share it. We're too much shame, too much embarrassment. Well, all of a sudden when a Cyrenian comes into contact with them and models for them that there's no shame. The Lord loves you in your woundedness, not in spite of them. The Lord finds you endearing because you're broken. He loves you even more because of your brokenness. And when the Cyrenian can model that kind of vulnerability to say, I know I'm loved as a beloved son, beloved daughter of God in my woundedness, then all of a sudden it liberates that soul to be able to open up about their burden, share it. And all of a sudden they realize that they're no longer alone in that very scary place of isolation when they're not able to speak to it.
When you talk about the Eucharist, how could this spirituality, this way of being, assist us and the Bishops' Conference in this year of the Eucharistic revival?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, and I'll reference St. Mother Teresa again, she's one of our patrons for this apostolate. But people always wondered, why there's so much work to be done through the day, there's all these poor in the streets. They're literally dying. And like, why do you and your sisters spend a holy hour in the morning before you go out? Isn't that kind of a waste of time? Because they would spend time in front of the Blessed Sacrament, the Eucharist. And she said that if we don't spend time in front of the Eucharist, we will never be able to recognize Jesus in the poor. And same thing for the Cyrenian. If we're not spending time in front of the Eucharist and we're able to recognize the presence of Jesus in these humblest of elements, calling out to us, and in this Eucharist, starving for our love and attention, and we allow Jesus to love us in that moment of encounter with the Eucharist, and we love him in return, it really becomes this exchange of hearts, cor ad cor loquitur. If we, only by doing that, will we be able to recognize the spiritually impoverished in our midst. You see, if we don't have this encounter with the Eucharist, we'll be blind to those who are suffering. It makes us discompassionate if we're not devoted to the Eucharist, because it's only the Eucharist that we see Christ's heart open before us, totally exposed, totally vulnerable. And it teaches us how to be totally exposed and totally vulnerable with others. And then we recognize that everyone's just thirsting for this love and attention. It's the Eucharist that teaches us how to recognize that. We're totally blind without the Eucharist. But the Eucharist gives us those contemplative eyes to see the eyes of Jesus looking back at us when we're loving our neighbor.
And Mary,
she's the best.
who never left the foot of the cross.
That's right.
Who watched her son suffer.
Yeah, so it's interesting that a lot of times people say the birthday of the church is Pentecost, which is true. But in the Catholic Church, there's actually two birthdays of the church. It's Pentecost, when the gift of the Holy Spirit comes down upon the apostles and Mary, our mother, and then they go out and preach the gospel to the ends of the earth. But the first birthday of the church was actually at the foot of the cross. And people say, well, why is that? And I said, well, Jesus is hanging on the cross. And of course, we know of his 7 last words, but what were one of his last words? Mother, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his home. The first community of faith established by Jesus was at the moment of the crucifixion at the foot of the cross. And I think it for the Cyrenian Apostolate, it models for us where community is to be found. It's to be found at the foot of the cross. And so Mary is our patroness because we know that she's always waiting for us there. And she models spiritual poverty perfectly. She models the Cyrenian Apostolate perfectly because she is saying at the foot of the cross, do not be afraid. It looks horrible. It looks gruesome. It's hard to behold. But then all of a sudden, when you see the cross through the eyes of faith, it becomes the greatest symbol of hope the human race has ever known. And so she teaches us how to embrace the cross in community with others without any fear or shame, and actually to find our home there. Because we recognize, and there's a 2nd century author that wrote this, you can find in the Divine Office, the Breviary, but the 2nd century author, we don't know who wrote it, which makes it even more amazing. He says, blessed are those who, putting all their trust in the cross, have plunged into the water of life. And I think Mary is the one who is saying, blessed are you when you put all your trust in the cross, because you're now plunging into the water of life.
It's beautiful.
And what does Mary do at the foot of the cross? She stands before Christ with empty hands. And all she does is offer Jesus her undivided love and attention, which is all Jesus is thirsting for from us. And that's why she's the perfect model for the Cyrenian Apostolate. That's why she's our patroness.
Empty hands and open hearts. Yeah. I want to read another quote from the book because it's in all of the chapters. And this brings us yet again to the spiritual core of the Cyrenian Apostolate, the deep hidden well from which we draw our life, the secret source of our evangelical power, and the spiritual time bomb that will explode into the life of the Church. It is the deep knowledge that we are beloved, that God the Father delights in us with a purifying love that leads to deeper trust and surrender to his will. So what would you tell people if they ask, well, what do I have to do to follow the Cyrenian way?
You got to let yourself be loved. You actually have to trust that you are beloved. That's the only action of the apostolate, is to let yourself be loved and then love in return as an act of thanksgiving. That's it.
Deep and simple. There it is. From your experience writing the book and your experience of those who accompanied you, what is your hope for that we wouldn't just read a book, that we would see Christ in the eyes of all those around us, that we would actively love and allow ourselves to be loved? But speak to how you hope that will assist our faith communities and our parishes.
Absolutely. It's a great question. So it's almost like what's the concrete action step for the Cyrenian Apostolate? And for me, it's just to create communities of prayer, intentional communities of prayer in each faith community. So every parish, every school, every apostolate, whatever is out there, to say that the first order of the Cyrenian business is to gather people in prayer at the foot of the cross. And so it's something that we call Cyrenian cenacles. And so it's a group of 7 to 10 people who would say, we're going to enter into intentional relationship with one another. We're going to intentionally accompany one another indefinitely. And so this core group of people in each faith community, each parish, will hopefully reverberate into the rest of the faith community and teach others on how to love in this way. But it all starts with gathering these Cyrenian cenacles, these Cyrenian prayer groups around the foot of the cross. So at least this core group of people can begin to trust that they're, 1, beloved, and 2, that they're never alone as they face the burdens in their own life. And so hopefully these cell groups, as I call them, will begin to multiply. And so that way there can be more groups that naturally occur. And the other thing about Cyrenian cenacles, it's never going to be advertised. You can only be invited into it because of a personal encounter with somebody. And the only way you find yourself in a Cyrenian cenacle is because of a human relationship, human contact with someone that first loved you in this way, and you felt called to love in that same way. So it's very organic, very natural, and again, goes back to that idea that every human relationship is the streets of Calcutta. So the only way we find ourselves in these little spiritual homes of cenacle is because you first encountered this kind of love from a Cyrenian.
What has the fruit been in your own life from this way of being, from writing the book, from encountering the initial group that was with you as you wrote?
Yeah, so the founding members of the group, there's 10 of them, and they started praying with me 3 years ago. And as I was producing different chapters, they would meet with me, and they would actually react to the material and the content. And it's amazing as we prayed together over all 5 chapters, just how much I learned from them. And I think the thing that spoke volumes to me is that this was speaking to their hearts. And then not only that, because they felt so drawn to it, they started loving one another in this way. So all of a sudden a group of lay faithful who just kind of like by happen chance were called together. 3 years later now, their relationships are so deep and they're bonded. And I'm sure you could speak to that from experience, this idea that this is a group of people who, because of this spiritual apostolate, the Cyrenian Apostolate, are now very vulnerable with one another and real with one another, and they're able to share burdens with one another, and they're really accompanying one another, and they're being transformed by that act of accompaniment by their neighbor.
It has been so life-giving to be part of it and to watch how God's math works when you think that by pouring out, you will have less, and you actually get filled back up.
That's
the
right.
5 loaves and 2 fish, every time.
It multiplies.
I remember the very first meeting that we had. It reminded me of the movie Clue, and we're all kind of there like, what am I doing here? How did we get here? And we're all looking at each other like, wait, you're here? Well, if you're here, why am I here? And over time, we, through our own journey, started to share the burden of the other, but recognize our giftedness to one another, just our way of being. And it was transformative, I think, and it's continuing to transform us. I can only speak for me.
You can almost see the guys, because of this, the spiritual pillars, they're beginning to delight in one another because they know they're being delighted in. Like they're being seen, and they're being received, and they're being known in deeper ways than they ever have. So you can almost see their eyes filled with delight as they behold one another, because they're also experiencing that in their relationship with Jesus, because they know when Jesus looks at them, Jesus' eyes are filled with delight, because the Lord's delighting in us. And when you live out of that knowledge, how can you not help but delight in others?
It changes everything. It changes everything.
Flips the world upside down.
If you would like to get a copy of the book, if you'd like more information on the Cyrenian Way, on the Apostolate, go to the Cyrenianway.org. You can also sign up for Lenten Reflections. If you would like to email the group, people can do that there, the Cyrenianway.org. Father Jason, thank you. Thank you for the gift of writing the book, for the way of being, and for being here today, and for helping other people be able to encounter the Lord through encountering one another in this way. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. It's so good to be with you, and God bless you.